In April 2003, in the Bavarian city of Fürth, an industrial era came to a quiet end. The massive factory gates were locked. Production lines that had once assembled the centerpiece of the German living room stopped moving. Grundig, a name that had defined post-war economic resurrection, filed for insolvency. At its peak, this company built millions of color television sets and supported an army of local repairmen across Europe. But by the spring of 2003, the workforce had been hollowed out. 3,000 remaining employees lost their jobs. The local assembly of high-end televisions could no longer be sustained. Yet there was a paradox. The televisions still worked. The brand name remained highly trusted. Millions of German households still watched the evening news on a Grundig screen. The logo survived. The factory did not. But the real story of Grundig is not the story of a 2003 bankruptcy proceeding. It is the story of how an entire national television system lost control of its components, its local repair networks, and ultimately, its manufacturing independence. Every week, we tell the stories of the television brands, factories, screens, shops, repair benches, and living rooms that once defined how Europe watched the world, and what remained when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in the rubble of Fürth, Germany in 1945. Before the brand became a household name across Europe, the German consumer electronics market simply did not exist. In 1945, the country was physically, politically, and economically devastated. There was no television broadcasting. In many cities, there was barely reliable electricity. The infrastructure of daily life had been reduced to concrete dust. Yet within this landscape of total collapse, there was a profound, immediate psychological need for information, for news, and for a connection to the outside world. Max Grundig, a 37-year-old radio dealer and technician, recognized that need. Operating out of a cramped, makeshift facility in the Bavarian city of Fürth, he faced a severe legal barrier. Allied occupational authorities maintained strict restrictions on the manufacturing of fully assembled radio receivers by German companies. The industrial production of complete broadcast electronics was heavily regulated to prevent rearmament. Grundig bypassed this restriction not through complex engineering, but through a brilliant reading of the law and the market. In 1946, he introduced the Heinzelmann. It was not sold as a finished radio. It was legally classified as a toy, a do-it-yourself construction kit deliberately sold without electrical tubes. The consumer had to source the vacuum tubes themselves on the gray market and assemble the wooden box, the wiring, and the tuning dials on their own kitchen table. The Heinzelmann was an immediate, overwhelming commercial success. Tens of thousands of kits were sold. Families gathered with soldering irons to build their own connection to the broadcast world. This single product generated the capital necessary to build a real company. It funded the rapid expansion of a proper manufacturing facility in Fürth, transforming a small workshop into an industrial assembly line. But more importantly, the Heinzelmann established the foundational DNA of the Grundig enterprise. The company learned how to read exactly what the domestic household needed at the exact moment they could afford it. It also established an early, vital relationship with specialized local electronics dealers who stocked the kits. By the early 1950s, the context had completely changed. The harsh restrictions of the immediate post-war era were lifting. The West German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, was beginning to accelerate. Wages were rising, the rubble was being cleared, and a new, vastly more complex broadcast technology was preparing to enter the domestic space. In December 1952, West German television broadcasting officially resumed. In that same year, Grundig translated its radio dominance into the visual age. The company introduced its first television receiver. They called it the Zauberspiegel, the magic mirror. The Zauberspiegel was not a casual purchase, and it was certainly not a lightweight appliance. It was a heavy, imposing object that demanded respect before it was even switched on. The physical reality of the early television was dictated entirely by its core component, the picture tube. The cathode ray tube was a massive, heavy glass vacuum chamber. Because the internal electron beam needed sufficient distance to sweep across the phosphor-coated glass to form an image, the tube was incredibly deep. This single piece of glass determined the entire architecture of the machine. It dictated the depth of the cabinet, the immense weight that two delivery workers had to maneuver up tight residential staircases, and the significant amount of floor space the family had to surrender in the corner of their room. Grundig understood that at this price point, often costing the equivalent of several months' wages for an average industrial worker, the television could not merely be a machine. It had to be a high-status piece of furniture. The company explicitly designed its early sets to match the heavy, polished wood aesthetic of post-war German living rooms. They did not outsource this critical element. Grundig established massive woodworking facilities to ensure the dark walnut and mahogany veneers met the exact standards of domestic cabinetry. When the screen was dark, the object still radiated permanence and wealth. The Sauberspiegel featured a modest 14-inch screen, but the cabinet around it was a statement of industrial intent. It featured a polished wooden frame, brass accents, heavy bakelite knobs, and a large acoustic speaker grill positioned below the glass. When a family purchased a Grundig television, they were not just buying a screen. They were buying a complete acoustic and visual environment engineered in Bavaria. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Grundig scaled its production rapidly. The cramped workshops of 1945 evolved into massive, integrated factories in the Nuremberg-Fürth region. Surviving product catalogs from this era show a brand meticulously expanding its lineup to cover every social stratum of the recovering nation, moving from compact tabletop units to massive console televisions with integrated record players. The brand established an ironclad symbiotic relationship with local electronics dealers, who proudly displayed the heavy wooden sets in their shop windows. Market dominance in the black and white era seemed absolute. The name was trusted. The factories were humming. But black and white television was fundamentally simple compared to what was coming. The real test of the brand and the technological architecture that would define its peak had not yet arrived. The television had entered the home, but the factory had not yet revealed its true technological ambition. In August 1967, the West German government fundamentally changed the domestic electronics landscape. At the National Radio Exhibition in West Berlin, Vice Chancellor Willy Brandt pushed a symbolic dummy button, officially launching color television broadcasting. The nation adopted the PAL standard, a phase alternating line system engineered domestically by Telefunken to correct the color-shifting flaws that plagued early American broadcasts. The resulting picture was brilliant, stable, and technologically sophisticated. But for mass-market manufacturers, color television presented a terrifying commercial risk. The sets were brutally expensive. In the late 1960s, a premium color television cost the equivalent of several months' wages for an average German industrial worker. Furthermore, color cathode ray tubes operated under extreme physical and electrical stress. The color picture tube alone weighed more than an entire black and white television. They required massive amounts of power, generated immense heat, and utilized internal high-voltage systems exceeding 25,000 volts. Because of this intense thermal and electrical pressure, early color components degraded quickly. Breakdowns were not a possibility. They were an absolute certainty. This created a severe retail barrier. To convince a family to hand over their savings for a heavy, fragile piece of technology, a manufacturer could not rely on picture quality alone. The consumer needed an absolute ironclad guarantee that when the machine broke, it could be fixed quickly, affordably, and locally. If a failure meant hauling a 50-kilogram wooden cabinet down 3 flights of stairs, loading it into a delivery van, and waiting weeks for a factory repair, the family simply would not buy it. Grundig recognized that the battle for the color living room would not be won by the glass alone. It would be won by the architecture behind the glass. To solve the service problem, Grundig engineers bypassed their competitors by introducing a revolutionary design philosophy that would define their peak era, the supercolor modular chassis. The chassis is the central nervous system of a television, the physical arrangement of boards, circuits, and components that translates raw broadcast signals into picture and sound. Historically, television internals were a single, complex tangle of point-to-point wiring or one massive unified printed circuit board. If a single capacitor blew, a technician had to transport the entire set back to a workshop, lean over it with a soldering iron, and spend hours diagnosing a vast landscape of identical gray components. Grundig tore that system apart. They divided the internal circuitry into discrete functional categories: color decoding, high voltage generation, audio processing, and tuning. Each function was built onto its own separate, removable printed circuit board. These individual boards slotted vertically into a main metallic frame, plugging into edge connectors exactly like heavy books sliding onto a library shelf. This modular architecture radically changed the physical reality of a repair visit. When a Grundig supercolor experienced a component failure, the family did not lose their primary source of entertainment for a month. The local independent repairman, the highly trained radio and Techniker, simply drove to the house. He walked into the living room, carefully turned the heavy wooden set around, and unscrewed the back panel. He did not need to warm up a soldering iron on the family's carpet. Guided by Grundig's immaculate, highly detailed service manuals, he observed the symptoms and identified the specific system failure. He reached deep into the back of the television, gripped the plastic edge of the faulty module, pulled it straight out of its socket, and slotted a fresh replacement board in its place. The technician could then take the broken board back to his shop, repair the individual resistor at his own workbench, and put the board back into his service inventory. Within 20 minutes, the back cover of the television was secured, the high-voltage flyback transformer hummed back to life, and the family was watching the broadcast again. This engineering decision transformed the retail landscape. When a customer walked into a local, specialized electronics shop, they were faced with dozens of screens from fierce domestic competitors like Telefunken, Saba, and Nordmann. But the dealer, the man holding the ultimate influence over the family's purchasing decision, did not just sell the brightness of the screen. He sold the repairability. He actively recommended Grundig over the alternatives because Grundig made his business efficient, predictable, and highly profitable. The company provided these independent shops with a steady supply of standardized replacement modules, rigorous technical seminars in Firth, and an unbroken chain of logistical support. By designing a machine that was inherently easy to service, Grundig had effectively turned every independent electronics technician in Germany into an aggressive, loyal ambassador for the brand. Foreign competitors looking to enter the European market struggled to counter this advantage. An imported television might feature a sharp picture, but it could not instantly replicate the massive domestic infrastructure of service manuals, spare parts distribution, and trusted local technicians that Grundig had cultivated. The supercolor chassis allowed the factory to dominate the market by proving that their machines were explicitly built to be kept alive. But this spectacular breakthrough contained a hidden structural flaw. The modular system required hundreds of extra physical connectors, heavy metal framing, and extensive manual assembly inside the manufacturing plant. It was an expensive, over-engineered solution designed for an era when labor was domestic, materials were entirely controlled by the company, and televisions held their premium retail value. The screen solved one problem and created another. The company had built an invincible national repair system, but it was a system that could only survive if the price of the television never fell. By the mid-1970s, the Grundig name was inescapable. It had evolved from a makeshift post-war radio workshop into a titan of European consumer electronics. Max Grundig presided over an industrial empire that employed tens of thousands of workers, primarily concentrated in the Franconian region of Bavaria. The company was no longer just participating in the Wirtschaftswunder. It had become one of its defining physical monuments. The scale of domestic manufacturing during this period was staggering. The Grundig Werke facilities spanning Nuremberg and Firth were not merely assembly plants where imported parts were screwed together. They were virtually self-sufficient industrial cities. They ingested raw copper wire, massive sheets of glass, tons of plastic pellets, and vast quantities of timber. Out of these raw materials, they manufactured their own transformers, wound their own coils, molded their own cabinet fascias, and engineered their own complex printed circuit boards. In 1979, the company pushed its manufacturing footprint even further, opening a colossal new television and video production facility in the leasing district of Vienna, Austria. This expansion demonstrated a profound confidence in the European manufacturing model. Grundig was building massive, permanent infrastructure based on the belief that consumers would always pay a premium for localized engineering and domestic assembly. At the center of this commercial dominance was a specific piece of marketing material, the annual Grundig product catalog, often branded as the Grundig Review. For the West German consumer, this was not just a brochure, it was a heavily circulated cultural artifact. In the weeks leading up to the Christmas purchasing season, families would study the thick, glossy pages. The catalog presented the television as the ultimate domestic achievement, a technological marvel wrapped in a traditional, comforting aesthetic. The physical presence of a Grundig supercolor television in these catalogs was deliberate. The sets were massive. They featured deep, heavy cabinets finished in dark walnut, teak, or mahogany veneers. They rested on robust floor stands or sleek, space-age metallic pedestals. The sheer weight of the cathode ray tube inside dictated this bulk, but Grundig turned that necessity into a virtue. The television was marketed as a piece of high-status furniture that would anchor the living room for a decade. When a family finally decided to make the purchase, they did not go to a massive, impersonal hypermarket. They went to the local Fachhändler, the independent, specialized electronics retailer on the high street. The showroom floor was a wall of glowing phosphor and polished wood, but the transaction was built on more than aesthetics. It was built on the unseen architecture of the supercolor chassis. The salesman could confidently assure the father of the family that this immense financial investment was protected. If the picture suddenly collapsed into a horizontal line, or if the color decoder failed, the set would not have to be shipped back to Bavaria. The technician sitting in the workshop at the back of the store had the exact Grundig service manual, the exact training, and a shelf full of modular replacement boards ready to deploy. The local retailer locked in the brand's national market share because the factory had explicitly designed a machine that protected the retailer's livelihood. This combination of industrial scale and local service culminated in a profound cultural presence inside the home. The television was no longer a novelty. It was the primary conduit for national memory. In the summer of 1974, West Germany hosted the FIFA World Cup. Millions of Germans gathered in their living rooms, pulling their armchairs closer to the heavy wooden cabinets of their Grundig supercolor sets. The physical ritual of switching the machine on was a sensory experience entirely distinct from modern flat panels. A hand reached out and pushed the heavy mechanical power button. It locked into place with a firm, satisfying click. For a few seconds, the screen remained dark as the internal heaters warmed the cathode ray tube. Then the high-voltage flyback transformer engaged, emitting a subtle, high-pitched whine that signaled the presence of 25,000 volts of electricity. Static electricity prickled against the thick glass of the screen. Finally, the picture blossomed outward from the center, a rich, brilliant, highly stable image decoded by the domestic PAL standard. When Gerd Müller scored the winning goal against the Netherlands in the final at the Olympiastadion in Munich, that historic national moment was delivered into millions of homes through a machine engineered in Firth. In that living room, the television was not simply a domestic appliance. It decided where the family sat, what they watched together, and how the outside world entered the domestic space. It was a physical agreement between the factory workers in Bavaria, the engineers who designed the plug-and-play modular boards, the local dealer who guaranteed its life, and the family who spent their savings to bring it home. If the factory disappeared, the country would not simply lose another electronics plant. It would lose the tens of thousands of workers, the specialized component suppliers, the deep repair knowledge of the high street technicians, and the industrial confidence required to build the most important screen in the house under a domestic name. In the showroom, the Grundig badge did more than identify the manufacturer. It told the customer which factory, which service network, and which engineering tradition stood behind the glass. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, the company appeared totally invincible. They produced premium sets with increasingly advanced features, integrating early teletext modules, sophisticated multi-speaker audio systems, and wireless remote controls that emitted ultrasonic clicks. They dominated domestic sales and exported heavily across Europe. But the massive weight of this industrial machine, its heavy wooden cabinetry, its highly complex modular internal boards, and its reliance on expensive domestic labor, was hiding a profound structural vulnerability. The brand looked strongest at exactly the moment its weakness became fatal. The first crack in the Grundig empire did not appear on the factory floor in Firth, and it did not sound like bankruptcy. It appeared on the edge of town, and it sounded like a cheaper price tag. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the retail landscape of European consumer electronics began to fundamentally change. The traditional Fachhändler, the specialized independent high street shop where a trained technician explained the benefits of a modular chassis over a cup of coffee, was quietly losing its influence. They were being replaced by massive out-of-town electronics hypermarkets and discount appliance chains. These new retail environments changed the physical reality of buying a television. In a hypermarket, there was no workshop in the back room. There was no dedicated salesman to open the wooden cabinet and demonstrate the ease of replacing a circuit board. There was only a massive wall of glowing screens stretching for aisles and a piece of cardboard displaying the retail price. On that wall, Grundig found itself positioned directly next to a new wave of imported televisions from Japanese conglomerates like Sony, Panasonic, and JVC. The comparison was brutal. Japanese manufacturers had achieved immense, heavily automated global scale. They had heavily invested in single-board chassis designs, consolidating internal electronics into fewer, highly integrated circuits. They did not build televisions to be easily repaired by a local technician over 15 years. They built them so precisely that they rarely failed at all during their early life. Furthermore, technologies like Sony's Trinitron picture tube offered exceptional brightness and color clarity. Price compression had arrived. The West German consumer, facing slower domestic economic growth in the early 1980s, stood in front of the hypermarket wall and faced a simple mathematical decision. They were asked to pay a premium for a heavy Grundig wooden cabinet, a complex modular chassis, and a local service network that the new retail environment no longer actively promoted. The imported plastic television provided a sharper image immediately, and it cost significantly less upfront. The argument for repairability lost its commercial power when the cheaper alternative refused to break. Max Grundig, aging and watching the profit margins of his domestic empire evaporate, realized a terrifying structural truth. The company had a massive European footprint, but it lacked the sheer global scale necessary to fight the Asian conglomerates alone. The Grundig work required vast amounts of capital just to maintain its domestic labor force, leaving very little for the aggressive, high-risk research and development needed to match Japanese component integration. In 1984, facing mounting financial pressure, the company made a fateful, defensive decision. Max Grundig sold a 31.6% stake in his life's work to the Dutch electronics giant, Philips. In exchange for financial stabilization and vital access to Philips' massive, global component supply chain, management control was quietly transferred to Eindhoven. The founder officially stepped away from the operational helm. In 1989, Max Grundig died. The brand remained in the living room, and the local workforce continued to clock in at Firth. But the era of absolute independence was over. The company was now tethered to the strategic priorities of a much larger parent corporation. By 1993, Philips increased its stake and took majority control of Grundig. For a brief period in the mid-1990s, the alliance appeared to hold the line. Grundig produced high-end 100 Hz CRT televisions, sharing tube technologies and chassis designs with Philips. But the underlying structural rot had not been cured. It had only been temporarily subsidized. The final collapse of the manufacturing system was triggered by a dual crisis: a massive corporate restructuring from above and a violent technological displacement from below. By 1998, Philips itself was in deep financial peril. The Dutch conglomerate was being battered on the global market by the same Asian competitors that had wounded Grundig a decade earlier. To save Philips, CEO Cor Boonstra initiated a ruthless global restructuring campaign known as Operation Centurion. The mandate was simple: any division or subsidiary that was bleeding cash and dragging down the parent company's stock price had to be immediately shut down or divested. Grundig was losing hundreds of millions of German marks. Its domestic factories, still burdened by high labor costs and complex legacy production methods, were fundamentally uncompetitive. Philips made the cold, necessary corporate calculation. In 1998, they officially pulled out, transferring their controlling stake in Grundig to a Bavarian consortium composed of antenna manufacturer Catherine and local banking interests. This transfer was not a rescue, it was an amputation. The Bavarian consortium provided emergency liquidity, but they could not provide the one thing the company needed to survive the impending technological revolution: a multi-billion-dollar panel fabrication plant. At the exact moment Grundig lost the backing of a global conglomerate, the television industry began the most expensive transition in its history: the shift from the cathode ray tube to the flat panel display. The transition to LCD and plasma completely broke the traditional European manufacturing model. For 50 years, Grundig's power resided in its ability to design the chassis, win the copper coils, and build the heavy wooden environment that supported the picture tube. But a flat panel television did not require a deep wooden cabinet. It did not require a heavy flyback transformer. 2 retail workers could lift it. A consumer could hang it on a wall. The LCD changed the fundamental definition of what a television factory actually did. The value of the machine no longer lay in the analog circuitry. It lay almost entirely in the glass panel itself. Building a modern LCD fabrication plant required an upfront capital investment of several billion dollars. The independent Grundig, freshly cut loose by Philips, simply did not have the money. They suffered absolute component dependence. To sell a flat-screen television, Grundig engineers in Firth had to purchase finished LCD panels from Asian suppliers like Samsung, Sharp, or LG. The object changed completely. The factory in Bavaria was no longer a place where raw copper and glass were transformed into a television. It became an expensive assembly station. Workers took an imported Asian display panel, screwed it into a plastic bezel designed in Germany, attached a third-party digital processing board, and slapped the Grundig badge on the front. They then had to attempt to sell this assembled machine at a premium price based entirely on the fading memory of the brand's history. It was an impossible commercial equation. Without control over the panel, Grundig could not control the cost, and they could not control the technological differentiation. The local service network, the backbone of Grundig's historic success, died alongside the CRT. When an LCD television failed, a technician could not drive to the house and pull out a plug-in supercolor module. If the panel cracked or the integrated digital board failed, replacing the part was nearly as expensive as buying a brand new, cheaper imported television. The radio and Fernsehtekniker was systematically removed from the living room. By early 2003, the cash reserves were exhausted. The banks refused further credit. In April 2003, the company officially filed for insolvency. The remaining 3,000 workers across the region were dismissed. The vast factory gates in Firth and Nuremberg were chained shut. The assembly lines were auctioned off. The cabinet became thinner. The margins became smaller. The panel came from elsewhere. The dealer changed the display. The repair counter lost its parts. The badge remained. The television Grundig AG was dead, liquidated in the bankruptcy courts of Bavaria. The physical factories in Firth and Nuremberg, which had once operated as massive self-contained industrial cities employing tens of thousands of workers, were permanently silenced. But in the modern consumer electronics industry, a highly recognized trademark is rarely allowed to die alongside its manufacturing base. The brand name had lived in millions of European living rooms for half a century. It was simply too valuable to bury. In 2004, the remaining assets and the rights to the Grundig name were carved up and sold off. The television and consumer electronics division was acquired by a joint venture consisting of the British electronics distributor Alba Radio and the Turkish industrial conglomerate Koç Holding, the parent company of the appliance giant Beko. By 2007, the Turkish conglomerate bought out its British partner, taking full, undivided control of the Grundig trademark. Today, if you walk into a major electronics hypermarket in Berlin, Munich, or Frankfurt, you will easily find a brand new Grundig television. It might feature a sleek 4K OLED display, a sophisticated smart TV platform, and a plastic bezel so thin it practically disappears against the living room wall. But the object sitting on the showroom floor represents a total separation of identity and engineering. The current trademark owner is Turkish. The television is manufactured in Beko's massive, highly automated assembly plants in Istanbul. The flat panel glass is sourced from the global supply chain, likely originating from major panel foundries in China or South Korea. The internal digital processing boards are built on international platforms. The software that runs the streaming applications is licensed from global tech giants. There is absolutely no engineering, manufacturing, or physical connection to the empty factory spaces in Franconia. The Grundig badge is now a licensing tool and a marketing wrapper, a trusted, historically familiar European sequence of letters applied to an efficient, globally sourced consumer electronics commodity that shares nothing but the font with the original company. If you travel to Firth today, the vast Grundig Werke facilities have been completely transformed. The historic factory halls where thousands of workers once wound copper coils, soldered connections, and assembled the supercolor modular chassis have been repurposed or demolished. Some buildings were torn down to make way for modern commercial parks and office blocks. Others were converted into residential lofts or logistics centers. The monumental industrial ecosystem that defined the city's economy has been erased from the skyline, leaving behind only scattered architectural remnants and municipal memory plaques. The local radio and Fernseh Techniker, the independent repairman who built his livelihood on the brand's modular architecture, has largely disappeared from the high street, forced out of business by integrated circuits, sealed panels, and the falling cost of simply buying a new replacement television from a discount chain. Yet the legacy of the original company has not been entirely erased, and it has not been relegated solely to the static displays of the Rundfunk Museum in Firth. It survives in a deeply practical, physical form. Across Europe, in the basements and living rooms of a highly specialized subculture, the original Grundig cathode ray tube televisions are currently experiencing a fierce resurgence. This is not nostalgia. It is the survival of specialist knowledge driven by strict technical requirements. The heavy wooden cabinet CRT sets, particularly the later 100 Hz models and the Super Color line, are highly prized by the retro gaming and vintage computing communities. Modern LCD and OLED panels digitally process incoming analog signals, introducing display lag and altering the raw pixel geometry of early consoles. Light gun games fundamentally refuse to work on flat panels because they rely on the exact microsecond timing of an electron beam sweeping across the glass. The original Grundig CRT draws the analog image instantly, exactly as the hardware intended. They are sought after for their incredibly robust power supplies, their superior RGB picture decoding via the SCART connection, and the deep, rich audio generated by massive internal speakers. More importantly, these machines are surviving because the factory in Bavaria explicitly designed them to survive. Online electronics forums and international repair communities are filled with digitized, meticulously detailed Grundig service manuals. A new generation of hobbyists is currently using the exact same schematic diagrams that the local high street technician used in 1978. When a capacitor fails today, the television is not thrown away. A modern enthusiast unscrews the heavy back panel, pulls out the specific modular circuit board, replaces the individual component at their own workbench, and slots the board back into the heavy chassis. The collapse of Grundig was not a failure of engineering. It was the collapse of a specific economic agreement. For decades, the brand proved that a television could be a permanent domestic investment, supported by local labor and maintained by local knowledge. But the global market ultimately decided that it preferred a disposable screen to a repairable machine. The company lost its factories, its workforce, and its independence because it could not adapt its heavy, localized mechanical philosophy to a weightless, globalized, digital age where the price of the panel dictated every other decision. In a small workshop outside Nuremberg, the wooden cabinet of a surviving set is severely scratched. The mechanical power button requires a firm, deliberate push, and the picture takes several long seconds to warm up. But the cathode ray tube still gathers light. The high-voltage flyback transformer emits its familiar, high-pitched hum, and the German machine builds one more image. See you in the next video.